Welcome back, folks, to my tutorial series. Creoles are not a distinct kind of language, true or false, or the main point of this. Do linguists, as opposed to historians or anthropologists, have any reason to be interested in these languages? This week, Lesson 2. Our question: has the idea of a Creole prototype been refuted? That is, I proposed in writing that first appeared in 1998 that there is a certain kind of grammar that can only come from some kind of pidginization or break in linguistic transmission in the past, which means that there is a kind of language structure, a kind of language type that can only be a Creole language. Now, you may well have heard, if you've had any interest in this issue, that that idea was just shot down like some sort of balloon 20 years ago and everybody has moved on. The question is, was it shot down? The Creole prototype idea is actually pretty simple. My point was not that there are features that are unique to Creoles that don't appear in other languages, but that you can know that a language is a Creole based on three absences. And I've written about this in various places. The whole idea is, first, if a language has no paradigmatic inflection; second, it has no lexical or grammatical tone; and three, no opaque derivation. My hypothesis is that if a language, this being a full language, a real language with complexity and nuance, but if that's a language that combines these three absences, then you can know its history, because those are things that you would expect of a language that was born as a pidgin or something like it not long ago and hasn't had time to amass the mess that older languages have. Now, it's easy in the memory to think that I just said no inflection, no tone, and opaque derivation. But of course, I wouldn't propose anything that simple. And so we have to know exactly what I meant by paradigmatic inflection, for example. So, there are Creoles that have some inflections. Tok pisin here, I boil water, me boil im water. Many would analyze that as an inflectional marker. In Creole Portuguese Creole, there's even a progressive inflection, a perfect inflection, and a past inflection. Now, some people think that because of that, that just kills the whole prototype idea, but I don't mean just inflection. What I mean is paradigmatic inflection. One definition of that is by Edith Moravchik and Worth: overt marking of subdivisions of semantic space such that the subdivision is denotationally arbitrary. So a good example of this would be Latin declensions or grammatical gender. So there being an inflection doesn't refute this. It's the kind of inflection that a language might have that can mark whether it used to be a pidgin. Also, we have to remember that it doesn't matter whether the inflection is bound or not. So we don't just mean inflectional suffixes or prefixes. Inflection as a concept can be a free morpheme as well. And so, for example, numeral classifiers aren't traditionally thought of in this way, but more and more linguistic work is showing that they can be thought of this way, and the reason is that numeral classifiers often mark things that we can easily imagine that seem quite regular, such as some things being round, some things being long and thin. But in practice, there's an awful lot of irregularity in how numeral classifiers are applied in a language. This isn't something that especially a short grammar is going to mention. It isn't something often that native speakers have any reason to be aware of. But for example, in Mandarin Chinese, you have ji, and that's for animals, but not all of them. And then birds, but then you find out that you have to use it for eyes and hands, and you think, well, okay, pairs, and maybe animals come in pairs, but then it's also used for suitcases, boats. There's an extent to which you just have to know. Or something like ba. It's used for things you can hold. Already a little vague, given you can hold quite a few things, but knives, teapots, okay, but chairs? I don't hold chairs much. And then aging, certainly something that you wouldn't want to hold, even if you could. So what this means is that we're in the realm of the craziness of the grammatical gender that we're familiar with in European languages. This sort of thing is gender. So when we talk about inflection, it's not just affixes, it's what is an inflectional piece of work in the language in general. That doesn't have to be bound. A lot of people who criticize Creole exceptionalism talk about Eurocentricity. Well, let's get away from Eurocentricity and talk about what inflection really is. It doesn't have to be an affix. If you accept that, well, then you're stuck accepting this. Then, tone. So, I don't just mean whether or not a language uses tone, because plenty of Creoles use tone in suprasegmental ways and in some ways that are more idiosyncratic than that. But what I mean is encoding lexical differences alone, not just along with stress, which frankly isn't interesting and isn't definitive of a language that came from a pidgin, or grammatical tone. So, Lahu is a Sino-Tibetan language. It has, depending on how you count it, 7 tones. I'm only giving 5 of them. And you see how it works. Usually somebody uses Mandarin to exemplify this. I'm tired of that, so there's Lahu. Or Edo is a Niger-Congo language, and you can see that tonal changes indicate grammar. So we're talking about tone alone, not tone that works in parallel with stress. And we're talking about the kind of tone that creates lexical and grammatical differences. In other words, kind of linguistics course tone, not just whether or not tone plays some kind of role in the language's structure. Then finally, opaque derivation. And what I mean is illustrated with this picture of Daffy Duck. There's a point in the wonderful cartoon Duck-a-Muck where Daffy says, "Let's have an understanding." And then all of a sudden, all this black muck comes down and he's standing under it and it keeps on pressing down and he's understanding this muck. That's funny because, of course, understanding is not literal in this sense. You might ask, what are you standing under? So what I mean is, if a language starts as a pidgin, from only a few hundred words, and then coalesces with a new lexical web, and you have a brand new language, it'll take time for there to be cases like understand, because those take time. Presumably, there was a time when probably Proto-Germanic speakers understood what was being standed under, so to speak. The meaning got lost, and now we just use it as a chunk. But what would be different, you could call it interesting, about a new language is that cases like that wouldn't have emerged yet because not enough time would have passed. So there would be more compositionality, you could say transparency, in derivation of that kind. Now, of course, these sorts of things are clinal. Enoch Abo and Norval Smith pointed out back in 2009 that, well, derivation is never completely predictable, never completely transparent. So goal kick, the example they use, is not completely transparent because it means more than exactly what goal and exactly what kick mean. But that doesn't knock the prototype idea down conclusively the way they and so many people seem to think. Here is a cline of gradations of derivational opacity. Strictly predictable is something like recount, you count again. Now then you have unpredictable but recoverable, and that's metaphorical cases such as overlook. Overlook doesn't usually literally mean that you are looking up and beyond something. It's more a matter of you overlooked a piece of data, or somebody doesn't get asked to dance, or something like that. So it isn't predictable. However, it actually is recoverable from the meaning of over and look. There's been an extension. Then the fourth step, we'll get to the third one in just a second. The fourth step is when derivation isn't even processable as derivation anymore. Sloth starts as sloth from slowness. We don't think of the th in warmth and sloth and mirth and girth as a piece of morphology at all. Now, for many people, that's just it. But there's actually a place in between 2 and 4 that is also part of how we use derivation when we use a language. And that's cases that are opaque and yet they're analyzable as morphology. And that's what understand is. As in, we don't know what you're standing under. We can laboriously figure that maybe somebody once thought of comprehension as standing under something, but it doesn't really make sense. Yet, we do know that under and stand are distinct things. We process the under as having a morphological function. Opaque, yet analyzable. That's what I mean by derivational opacity. Languages have that, unless, in my hypothesis, they're brand new. Now, one might say, no, there's no metric. You're not talking about discrete steps. How do we measure? What are you saying? But, I think, frankly, that most linguists know what I'm saying. After all, none of us have any problem with the clinal when it comes to grammaticalization, Creole continua, first language acquisition, language contact theory, in other words, linguistics. Really, we all understand that language often isn't like quantum physics. So we're not going to have just pluses and minuses. Wouldn't it be nice if language worked that way? Or maybe it wouldn't, but we know it didn't. And we know, therefore, that if I give you that 1, 2, 3, 4, that's a perfectly valuable metric, which itself can either be supported or shot down. But the idea that that's not science is frankly absurd. To reject it here is arbitrary and frankly biased. Now, there are two things that can pull Creole languages away from the prototype. Every language that's called a Creole, every language that is discussed by Creolists does not exemplify the prototype perfectly because we're dealing with the clinal, as we would expect. That does not ruin the whole idea the way so many Creolists, I think, pretend to think. So, for example, Saramaccan, that's the Creole that I'm most familiar with. Well, he, she, or it. Is the negator, so not. So there's a grammatical tonal distinction. So, no, because it can be shown with analysis of documents of Saramaccan as well as comparative reconstruction that nobody would disagree with, or at least that I have not seen anybody disagree with in the 25 years that I've had material on this in print. You can see that that difference between meaning he and she and meaning not arose after the language formed. So when Saramaccan formed, it didn't have these cases where you could encode grammar with tone. It happened bit by bit through the stages that you can see here on the slide. And I'm not going to narrate them, but for those of you who are interested, this is how it happened. That's neat in itself, but it doesn't mean that there's no such thing as a Creole prototype, because these languages are at all times, including right now. Tick, tick, it's happening now, moving away from this unusual state of being a language just some steps past having arisen as a break in transmission. So, for example, Papiamentu has some grammatical tone. It's neat. That does not refute the proposal because it can be shown conclusively that that's something that has happened long after the genesis of the language. Creolization, Creole genesis, creates a certain kind of grammar. That immediately starts changing because of the natural exigencies and randomnesses of language use. I give you here a reference that will give you the argument in a detail that I wouldn't want to go into here. Then there's another exception. Contact with source languages can pull Creoles away from the prototype. So, for example, here is Haitian, and you look at the r prefix, and you can see that it's not compositional. You can't identify a particular meaning that this prefix has. So, poser, to ask, and then reposer, misspelled, apology, it means to rest. Well, what is re if you're going from poser to reposer? Tirer, to pull, retirer, to remove. Okay, they're related, but what exactly is the meaning of the re here? Now, I'm not going to cite where Michel de Graff first presented this to the Creolist community because the title of the presentation included profanity. Can you imagine? However, it's true that there is non-compositional derivation in a Creole like Haitian. Frankly, some. I've written about this. It's not a whole lot. But It's there. And this is because Haitian has coexisted with French for all of its existence. And so a lot of French vocabulary, including the French vocabulary that has the non-compositional derivation that any older language has seeped into the Creole. So the world cannot cooperate perfectly with my Creole prototype. But the fact that many Creoles, and as a matter of fact, it's all of the French ones, have thrived in a diglossia doesn't refute the proposal. A lot of Creoles have not existed in a diglossia or any kind of relationship with their source languages, and those are the ones where the prototype is exhibited in its purest form. So, Saramaccan, in all of its glory, is a prototype Creole. There is no paradigmatic inflection in Saramaccan. It's got lots of tone, but the tone that it has either marches in lockstep with stress, and that doesn't say anything about pidginization on either end, or it's lexical and or grammatical tone that can be shown to have emerged after the genesis of the language, and that's something quite different. Then in terms of derivation, well, if you go through Saramaccan's lexicon to the extent that it's been documented, which is fairly healthily, then what you find is that certainly the derivation isn't predictable at all times, but from what I've seen, it isn't opaque. And so slap is wide hand. You understand why. You can understand why a kind of long grass would be called a monkey knife, or that to worry is to break your head. These are metaphoricizations. But the number 3 kind of derivation seems not to be there. I've argued this, and I'd be interested if somebody shot that down, but so far what there's been is just silence. Now, what you'll hear is that there have been counterexamples to the prototype put forth. And so the whole thing is just hopeless, and the world has moved on. And it's interesting because most Creolists know me. If there were counterexamples presented, don't Creolists know that I would have had something to say about it? I mean, what kind of personality do they think I am? In any case, I'm not sure what people know about these counterexamples. I suspect that many people have heard that there are some, but couldn't name what they are. Or if they could, let's deal with them. There have been 4 main ones that we really just have to get past. There's a dialect of French, Magua French, spoken in Canada. And one person has claimed that this language reached the prototype state. Well, you know what? It didn't. It's French. It is an ordinary kind of French. And yes, it's got a lot of inflectional erosion, but it's a language with plenty of paradigmatic inflection, plenty of non-compositional derivation, because it's French. So, we'll just get rid of that one. What else? Mandarin Chinese. So it's been said by one person that there's some Mandarin Chinese dialects that only have 3 tones instead of 4, and that makes those dialects of Chinese pretty close to the usages of tone that you find in some Creoles. Well, frankly, that's ridiculous. Even if you have a 3-way tonal distinction of lexical items rather than the 4 that you canonically have in Mandarin Chinese, that's nothing like anything that anybody has ever documented in any Creole. I'm not even going to name the person who put this forth. I'll just use their initials, Umberto Ansaldo. So we'll just let that go. But there have been a couple of other cases that are more interesting, but still they don't work. Here is Soninke. That's a Mande language. Maybe Mande is Niger-Congo. I frankly doubt it, but it's spoken in Africa. Now, someone has put forth that Soninke just happens to have floated into being like a proposed prototype Creole, and this therefore disproves that only Creoles can be that way. But really, when you analyze Soninke, I don't mean analyze, I mean look at material documented from it, you find that that simply doesn't work at all. Soninke has lots of inflectional affixation. Now, you might say, as the person who made this claim, that these things are clitics. Frankly, I think you probably would not, and I've written about this. They really don't seem to be clitics in terms of, for example, what Messrs. Zwicky and Pullum have told us about how you distinguish a clitic from an affix. But Soninke has all of this that you see here on the screen. And it doesn't matter, as we've noted, whether these things are bound or not. They are inflection, and Soninke has got plenty of it. Goodbye, Soninke. What else? Old Chinese. It's interesting. Jeffrey Sampson is a linguist I have profound respect for, and yet he and I differ on whether or not Old Chinese was a prototype type language. I'm almost perplexed that he put this forth. Basically, Old Chinese does seem Creole in that it certainly was not inflected, and even the numeral classifiers hadn't set in yet, and it wasn't tonal. But 101 about Old Chinese, this comes up in any treatment of it, is that its derivation was noticeably opaque. So for example, you have this s suffix, and here it is applied to various words in Old Chinese. It's impossible to identify what this s meant. So to walk, add that, and you get behavior. To salt, add that s, and you get salt, as in first you have the noun and then you have the verb. You have reply to a greeting, add that suffix, and it becomes reply to a person. And so on. One has no idea because it's like understand. A lot of time had gone by. So that disqualifies it. It's not just the inflection and the tone. If the derivation doesn't work, then based on my proposal, we do not have a Creole-like language. So goodbye, Old Chinese. Now, I've published on this often. I have explained as carefully as I could why I didn't think that these proposed counterexamples went through. I'm giving you a few of the places, 4, that I've said this. And yet, even today, you'll hear people say, oh, there have been counterexamples proposed, as if I never wrote these things. Now, the fun case, the counter proposal that's been brought up that I've really enjoyed, partly because it was the way that I've gotten to know my friend David Gill, and partly because it's just neat, is Riau Indonesian, a colloquial Indonesian. Here's somebody who actually brought up a language that was like a Creole. The joy is that David actually seems to find this interesting. And so, forget inflectional affixation and its numeral classifiers. It doesn't really like them either. It barely uses them. It's not a tonal language, and the derivational prefixes are used sparsely and with inconsistent and bleached meaning. So this is what I mean. Here is a language that parallels languages like Sranang and Saramaccan, or Tokpisin and its sisters, or the Creole Portugueses of the Gulf of Guinea. These are the prototype type Creoles. Very interesting. Now, you know what I think? I think that Riau Indonesian, in having these features, is a Creole that we weren't calling one. Now, it would be easy to say, oh no, he's not playing fair. If you show him a language that has those traits, then he'll just say it's a Creole. I've heard that said when somebody thought that I wasn't listening, and I'm not going to say who it was even. Their initials, it wasn't one of my 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But that's simply not true. Because Riau Indonesian has a very particular history. It was a dialect of a language born of heavy adult acquisition. Then, itself used heavily and possibly primarily as a second or third language, not as a first one, by most of its speakers. And then, dialects of Indonesian similar to Riau Indonesian have long been called pidgins and creoles and products of second language acquisition. So, for me to say, well, wait a minute, this is basically what I've been talking about, it's just that it isn't a language that was created by African people on plantations. This is a language that has had a break in transmission and lives on. Is that unfalsifiable reasoning? I'm afraid not. I would say that many unbiased observers would think that I was just trying to do something called science. Maybe succeeding, maybe not. But I'm not playing games. I have explained all of this in defining Creole on certain pages, and then a whole argument about the history of Malay that covered well over 50 pages in my book Language Interrupted. So I just wanted to be clear that I'm not just sounding off here in this format. This is based on something I've thought a lot about. So, not playing games, and for people to say, oh, he'll just say it's a Creole, I think that that's a little biased. Basically, an assumption that any counter-argument must necessarily refute my proposal, that anything anybody says must shoot it down. And that if I have any counter-argument, then that's just waving my hands and wanting to be right and merits no engagement, and it's okay to pretend that I never even wrote it. What that reveals is a certain built-in and probably unconscious, but in a way unscientific leaning towards this. All statements, all proposals and counter-proposals and counter-counter-proposals should be evaluated. We shouldn't pretend that these things don't exist. So here's where we are. Anyone who says that the prototype idea has been refuted by counterexamples should be asked one simple question. What are they? You might be surprised by what answers you get or don't get if you actually ask that question and push it. Now, some people might say, have said, that these features that I've chosen are just arbitrary. No, because frankly, what those people really mean is, why aren't you saying that they're special Creole constructions that only appear in Creoles but can't be found in any other language, something about tense marking or word order? Why aren't you saying something that we can easily shoot down? You're coming up with these arbitrary things. They don't really seem to make any sense. I can see how maybe they don't seem to make sense, but let me put it this way. If a language started as a pidgin, are there aspects of its morphology, phonology, and semantics that might mark that this is a language that became a real language only centuries ago instead of tens of millennia ago? If you were going to ask that question about morphology, you'd look at the inflection. If you were going to ask it about the phonology, you'd look at the tone. If you were going to ask about semantics, you might ask about compositionality of derivation. That's all. Now, if one wants to shoot me down, and I'd be very interested to be, I have occasional masochistic tendencies, then what I want you to realize is that the idea is not just to look for a language that isn't tonal and doesn't have much inflectional affixation. That's a mistake that I see a lot of people making because I get the feeling I haven't pushed my own point hard enough. So for example, there's a language in Papua called Abun, and it doesn't have inflectional affixation. It looks, quote unquote, like a Creole. Aha! No. Here's why. For one thing, remember that we don't just mean inflectional affixation. This language has unbound inflection in the form of numeral classifiers, complete with the grammatical gender style irregularities that those classifiers always seem to have in languages. Then, also, you have to look at the language's derivation. And that can be hard because inflections and tones you'll find in the table of contents or the index, but not all grammars are going to address non-compositional derivation because it's not grammar, it's irregularity. So especially grammatical sketches are not going to mention it, and even some of the fatter grammars don't. And frankly, I think a lot of linguists think of it as boring because it's not grammar. I get that, but it's crucial here. It's every bit as crucial as the inflection and the tone, even though it seems less countable often. And that means that often you have to go to the dictionary or the word list or really read the entire grammar and look for the cases. But in the case of Abun, it's not really that hard. It has this non-compositional opacity. So for example, ket means roughly over to. So yeah is difficult. Yeah ket means surprised. Why? Ki is say. Ki ket means to slander. Maybe to say something over to somebody is to slander them, but that makes about as much intuitive sense as understand. You're just guessing. It's gone a long way. Abun has those traits. It's not tonal. But in terms of inflection, and derivation, it's not as much like a Creole as it may say. So the idea here is not just to find non-tonal languages that don't have much inflectional affixation. I found many, many of them 20 years ago when I first came up with the idea. You need the derivation as well. That can be a little harder to find, but it'd be fun to find it. This isn't falsifiable. No, very easily falsifiable. I claim that if a language is born amidst pidginization, then it leaves identifiable and diagnostic traits. That's all. The refutation: find an older language with no such history that settled upon the prototype combination just by chance. That's it. That would falsify it completely. Now, the falsification has to go through, and I'm sorry, but the big four that I mentioned don't even begin to. And with Riau Indonesian, you're talking about second language acquisition heaven. It's a very interesting case. What about some other language where there was no history like that? I would be falsified. That's it. But nobody has done it. Older languages that fit the Creole prototype are at least extremely rare. I think it's safe to say that at this point. Rare to the point that it would even be reasonable, and there'll be debate about this, where do you draw the line, but it'd be reasonable to explore whether this combination of features signals history in extensive acquisition by adults. So if it's that rare, then there might be reason to think that if you find one, it says something about its history. Isn't science supposed to be something that helps you draw conclusions that weren't possible before? Now, I'm saying all this not because I'm a racist, not because I walk merrily on, ignoring counter-arguments, but because science. Why am I showing a picture of Maisie Williams here? Because she wasn't born when I first proposed the prototype in January of 1997. It's been a long, long time now. No counterexamples. Ladies and gentlemen, when you're taught that the prototype proposal has been soundly refuted, you are not getting the information you need to decide whether Creoles are a kind of language. It's been 20 years now. Anyone who says that the prototype idea has been refuted by counterexamples should be asked one simple question: what are they? And you'll probably have to ask again, what are they? And if there's no answer, then I think our conclusion is obvious. See you next week.